Hi, everyone. I'm James Garbutt.
And I'm Denny Dumas.
And this is the Garbutt Dumas Real Estate Podcast.
What is that complicated document, Jamie?
This is a depreciation report, Denny.
Depreciation report. A lot of people have never heard about these things before. They are not a new thing anymore in Greater Vancouver strata properties. 2013 is when they came in.
Do you remember the shock and horror when they came in?
Do you remember? Yeah, how people were freaked out.
Yeah.
You're like, this is a terrible idea.
Stratas were scrambling to get them done. Some were finding out, they didn't have to do them. They just kept on opting out. Yeah. And then the people, when we were selling places, just because of how they're written, buyers, they're not buyer friendly. Yeah. So it jeopardized a lot of deals when it was new and may still be doing so today.
Well, that's the thing I want to get across today is one, maybe just briefly describe what they are and what they're used for and the benefits of them. But two, from an agent perspective and from a buyer perspective, like understanding how to interpret them and explain them to clients or how to understand them going into a purchase of a strata property. Let's start with what is a depreciation report? Why? Yeah, what are they?
There's probably a definition that we don't know about, but essentially it's an engineer firm that puts together a formalized report. It's kind of intended to be some sort of standardized report that evaluates older buildings, and I believe it just comes from just a lot of lack of information on some of these older buildings in the past, and buyers buying into them and running into occasionally worst case scenarios that are very expensive. So this is a proactive approach where buildings are responsible to have an engineering firm come in and analyze everything about their building. I think the downside of that is it's probably a good thing for some buildings and not so much for others. And what I mean by that, and there's a lot of instances where buildings that are very old, well, one, the depreciation reports don't look very, very, very good. But when I'm thinking of, say, Coquitlam West or certain parts of Port Moody, there's a lot of these old stratas that are more likely to get bought out from a developer than repair the windows in 25 years and the roof in however many years. So in some instances, the likely resale of certain old buildings and locations is to a developer. And then in some, the more common thing is that the recommended lifespan of a lot of these materials, or the effective age, which is a term that's used in this one in front of me, is a very conservative number. Mm-hmm. So, do you fix the windows at the effective age of the window, or do you let it ride for next to 10, 20 years until you need to, until they're starting to leak?
Yeah.
And so I think that's where a lot of the interpretation comes into play, is what is serious, what is not, and understanding that these are, engineers that are covering themselves.
Yeah.
And so they have to be conservative. They have to be, they don't want to have buildings under budget, if anything over budget. But if you budgeted on target with these reports, you would have very expensive strata fees in a lot of cases. And I'm just going to throw this up there and I'm going to say double.
Totally. Yeah. Going back to when depreciation reports were not very popular. And so this came in 2013, where stratas were basically required to produce a depreciation report every 3 years, unless the ownership group, unless the strata council, voted it down. So you actually have to bring it up every year at your AGM after 3 years to vote it down. And even in the first few years, a lot of buildings, stratas were voting them down right away. So a lot of buildings did not have them for first 3, 4, 5 years after 2013. And one big pro is that it gives buyers more information, which I like. Previous to having depreciation reports on a lot of buildings, there was a lot of times where we would be representing buyers in buildings and asking for strata documents. Strata documents are incomplete. It's really just minutes. Council minutes are talking about what current maintenance is happening in the building. It's not discussing what has happened in the past. And so when you're buying in an old building, pre-depreciation report days, you didn't really know things like dates of when the last time the roof was replaced, or if they've done plumbing updates, or any of that kind of information, just because they did not keep very good records. And if that particular seller had only been in the building for a couple of years, they'd have no idea about these dates. So you're asking listing agents questions, and their response is, I'm not sure, my seller's only been here for 3 years. So that doesn't really give a buyer a lot of peace of mind going into building, where I think the big pro of depreciation reports is just having a lot of information.
Absolutely. A lot of the stuff was unavailable.
Unavailable.
Like, you know, even inspectors couldn't get into the electrical room. You wouldn't know what's in there, or the mechanical room.
Yeah.
You know, because oftentimes a caretaker would have to let you in, and even if they were in, they were probably not the specialist to look at that item.
Yeah.
So yeah,
and you'd hear things like, you know, well, do you have any idea how old the roof is? And the response back would be like, well, it's not the original roof. Yeah. Okay, well, does that mean like 22 years old, 3 years old? Like you can, like, for a roof, it's fairly easy to tell from the exterior, just looking at it in terms of how old it is roughly. But like, those are the types of those are the types of problems that we'd run into without previous to depreciation reports.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The con of them, though, on the other side, is that they're long documents. The percentage of people that go through them in detail and understand the way that they're written and understand how to explain them is probably pretty low. So they're not meant to be taken word for word. I think this is important. They are produced by engineer companies that are very conservative in their outlook. So they'll say things in, like, let's use this roof example. They'll say things in the depreciation report like, asphalt shingle roof, typically these roofs last 20 to 25 years. In 20 years. So like, they always pick the low end of that, like, estimation of how long they're going to last. In 20 years, it's going to cost, let's say, $1 million to replace. And then they put that conservative outlook on a big graph that says, like, in 2020, you're going to have X number of expenses. 2021, you're going to have X number of expenses. 2022, X number of expenses, all the way for the next 30 years. Again, good to kind of have an idea and to allow, or even shed some light on the typical maintenance projects that should be coming up based on a building's age for the strata. Like, a lot of people running strata on strata councils have had very little experience in construction. So it's a good kind of guideline for them to at least be assessing building assets and saying, okay, well, our roof is 17 years old. You know, should we start planning maybe a roof fund so that when we need to replace it in 5, 7, 10 years, whatever that number is, we have a little bit of money set aside, rather than, oh shit, the roof is leaking, we need to replace it tomorrow.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think for large stratas, like real big complexes, these documents are very valuable because those ones are the ones where, you know, there's certain multi-building stratas that that need someone to take a thorough look and need it to be a law. Yeah. It's the smaller stratas that struggle to get these reports up to date and opt out of them. And it's the interpretation of the report that causes all the issues.
Totally.
You know, so I think if buyers and realtors on the buying end spoke to the engineer behind these reports, or spoke to someone with a construction, like a contractor, someone in construction, they would hear verbally from these people that this is, you know, the conservative, you know, aspect of the report. And if you pinpointed items like windows or certain things that are more cosmetic, or, you know, in this case, it's even got gates and railings that get replaced at a certain time. There's certain musts and there's certain, you know, nice to haves. Yeah. And so if you take all these figures as being accurate, and if you expect everyone to fund all these conservative expenses on the recommended schedule, well, I haven't seen a building that's even come close to that.
Not even close.
And even if it did happen, I think across the board, our strata fees would shoot through the roof to come up with it. So the dilemma there is, you know, from a resale standpoint, you like to have low strata fees so you can sell your place, and arguably it's better to do that lump sum assessment every once in a while. From a financial planning perspective, from a homeowner, it's nice to not have those surprise big lump sum, you know, payments every once in a while. So I don't know what the answer is, Denny, but I think if you interpret these with a grain of salt and you don't get too drawn into the facts that aren't going to, you know, be crucial, I think these are a lot of value. It's just that don't expect them to be renegotiation value. And if you kind of think that this building's going to fall apart based on the results of a conservative depreciation report, and the building's actually okay or average, you might be walking away from good deals too.
Totally. And that is where we have some big frustrations on the listing agent side, is people taking them word for word or not necessarily understanding them and presenting information to a buyer saying, well, looks like they're going to need to redo their parkade membrane in 3 years. Okay, well, let's assess what that means, right? So a parkade membrane is a huge, huge job. It's depending on the size of this membrane, but let's say a $1.5-2 million job, which is a lot of money. If the parkade is currently not, Jamie, depreciation report says parkade membrane is due in 3 years. It's at the end of its lifespan. We've got to replace the entire thing. You walk around the parkade, you see very little moisture. You see a few small cracks in the concrete. Looks like Strata's maintained it pretty well with the epoxy stuff that they put in to help stop the separation. There's no active water coming in. There's very little staining. Are you assuming that the parkade membrane is going to be done in 3 years?
Likely not, Denny. None of that scenario, no.
So this you like.
We'd be injecting resin into those cracks for the next 20 years before we do that parkade membrane.
And understanding that big jobs like that, they are going to be voted on by the strata. So it's not like, depreciation report says $4 million job next year. Has to be done. Where's the money coming from? No idea. This is something that is talked about likely quite a bit with the strata council, with the owners of the strata. This is something where they likely get a few different quotes from different contractors and different assessments. So some person might come in and say, this parkade membrane has another 10 years left on it. There's a couple spot fixes that we can do that are going to cost $15,000 instead of $1.5 million that are going to prolong the life of this membrane. Here's a few different options. And then the strata council is going to discuss it and vote on it. Just because it's in the depreciation report doesn't mean that that's the exact number that is coming out.
I think the parkade membrane is a good example of a monstrous bill that can be an absolute deal breaker for people. And it's one of those items that can also be a spot repair.
Yeah.
It can apply to a whole systematic, it could be the whole carport, which occasionally happens. And I think there was a building in New West, I think I drove by the other day that was going through that. And yeah, like Denny said, these are over $1 million projects. I had the fortunate benefit earlier in my career to represent 3 engineers that do depreciation reports, that work for firms that study these buildings and put these reports together. And I guess just to do the real Coles notes of what they were looking at, they were looking at the exterior envelopes of the buildings. That was their main focus, is the design and the envelope. What is it made of and what is the design? Mm-hmm. And for example, if you have a big exposed, if you have a high rise that's not rain screened and it's say not a concrete exterior, maybe it's like a stucco-like material, and there's hairline cracks underneath the windows, and there's no overhang protecting them, and there's no rain screen. If you see the cracks under the windows and you see that it's a 90s built exterior, there could be a likelihood in that particular kind of case that it's not a safe building or needs an envelope upgrade. But envelope was the number one thing for them, and parkade is up there as well. There's a lot of detail in these depreciation reports about boilers and gates and elevators, and those are expensive if you are solely responsible to pay for them, but as a percentage they're much less.
Yeah.
So if we want to just kind of highlight the real big takeaways of the big ticket items, I think parkade would be on that list, and exterior envelope. And exterior envelope goes for, usually it's the exterior material that triggers that, but when they do that, they often do the windows and the balconies and everything else with it. Yeah. If it is a rain screen, for example.
It's important. So like one of the things I'm trying to get across is how do we present this to, as a realtor, how do you present this to a buyer who maybe has never seen a depreciation report before and is not super educated on construction? I think it's important, one, to explain that depreciation reports are conservative in nature. They are a 30-year outlook of a building, and the likelihood of something being done on the exact date is pretty low. So explaining like what typically happens in terms of a strata. They're going to start assessing this particular asset, parkade membrane, whatever it is. They are going to contact a few different contractors to have them come in and assess what should be done, needs to be done. Do they need to do the whole thing? Has it failed that poorly, or is there spot fixes that can be done to prolong the life for another 10 years? And then let's say worst case scenario. So these are all the things that I'm going through when talking to a buyer. Last thing I talk about is if parkade membrane is done in 3 years from now. Let's say the entire thing's failed. It's a full-on waterfall in the parkade. Cars are soaked. You get a free car wash every day, but that's fine. Then you break it down, right? Break down the cost. So let's say they're estimating it to be $1.5 million. There's 250 units in the strata, whatever it is. Here's your unit entitlement for this specific building or for this specific unit. Here is what the potential cost could be if they vote to levy this 100% versus take some money from contingency or whatever. And when you break it, so I'm talking about parkade membranes because I had an experience last week with one that was outrageous. Let's just leave it at that.
Still sore sport?
A little bit. When we lose good deals, it really, it's frustrating. When I broke down that unit entitlement for that specific unit, the worst case scenario was a $4,500 bill, which is not fun for anyone. But when a buyer sees $1.5 million, they think, oh, geez, that's a lot of money. How am I going to come up with $1.5 million? Well, guess what? You're not paying for the whole thing. And the unit entitlement for that unit was $4,500. So...
And that's for a worst case of a parking scenario for this particular
That was
example?
worst case for a parkade membrane that they had, I think, in like 2027 or something like that.
That's a tough one, parkade, because it doesn't really add value from a resale point of view. You know, the buyer just expects it to work. Yeah. And if you rain screen the building, I'd like to think that you at least get half of that expense back and increased value because the building is rain screened. You can see it. Buyers appreciate it. Yeah. But in your case... $1.5 million bill translates to $4,500, translates to a collapsed deal. Yeah. And you're the agent, so you're the biased messenger that can't be trusted. So, how, at the same time, I think we can't control our agency relationship, but what we would say is just it's all about how you communicate it. And if unit entitlement's always a helpful tool for us realtors because these numbers are huge, and breaking it down to your unit is also important as well. But first-time buyers hearing $4,500 as a potential worst-case scenario 3 years out, that is a lot of money, but it's not. And I would say first-time buyers get used to those. I mean, if you're looking at a building that has that coming up, you're looking at an older building and you're getting more space for less price because of it. Yeah. So just that's a small percentage. If that is in combination with a poorly designed building that has rain screen issues or questions, that's another thing. Yeah. But if it's ticking all the boxes and there's a worst case scenario of $4,500 in 3 years, and that's the assumption there is that's like 1% of the purchase price. That's not that's a risk I would take on.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, you guys can sense a little bit of frustration in my voice describing this stuff, but. I guess I would like to provide a solution. I don't expect every single realtor out there to be a construction knowledge expert and to be able to navigate through the difficult 120-page reports that are depreciation reports. But don't present something to a client unless you actually know what it is that you're explaining. If you do not understand strata, let's say you're newer in the business, you've only seen a handful of depreciation reports, and this is not your expertise yet. Ask questions. Like call someone in your office that has been in the business for 20 years that does a lot of strata. Ask them what, window replacement. That it says window replacement in 3 years. Does that mean all the windows in the building are going to be redone at the exact same time in 3 years from now? No, I've never seen one strata do that. Have you ever seen a strata do all the windows? No. Windows, like a lot of things are kind of a case by case basis.
Unless it's a full rain screen, maybe.
Yeah, maybe a few rare cases, but a lot of things are case by case basis. So when things come towards the end of their typical lifespan, like a window, like even like balconies, stratas will assess the whole complex and say, okay, well, there's 3 balconies that have some real bad soft spots. We should get those done next year. And then there's a few more that have a few years left. So we're going to talk about them next year. But it like in rare cases we're redoing every window in the building for $5.5 million.
Oh, it's usually piecemeal. Like, well, I mean, that's like the balcony example you gave. That's very common. They do a few balconies at a time. And so, I mean, from a strata perspective, just once you get these depreciation reports done, if you do have a plan of action from that report that highlights the important items, get it in your minutes right after so that it isolates the items from a strata perspective that are important, because that might be very helpful for future buyers. Yeah. Although I don't think stratas are worried about buyers when they're doing their meetings. So we'll see how far that goes.
But they probably should be. They should at least take it into consideration in terms of how they present information, right?
It would be helpful for depreciation report comes in. That's a big document. It would be helpful for some sort of summary of that document into a plan. Not use the plan on the report. Yeah. The strata's version of that plan after. But, every building's different and there's a lot of politics and people involved. And I don't know what the answer there is, Denny, but I do think the overall positive from these reports probably outweigh the negatives as a whole. Yeah. But yeah, the negatives are frustrating experiences.
When we're on the other side, when we're on the buyer side, it's extremely helpful to have these reports, especially when you're looking at older buildings, just to give you specific dates. Like I said earlier, when I started in 2014, 2015, very few buildings had depreciation reports. And so when you're helping buyers going into like older buildings, 1960s, 70s, 80s buildings, there's a lot of question marks. Saying, well, have they redone the plumbing? Like, I don't know. I asked the listing agent. I've asked the last 3 buyers agents who've bought in this building. There's nothing in the minutes. There's no report, like a depreciation report, telling us how old the plumbing is, how old the whatever boilers are. I don't know. There's going to be question marks. Whereas this type of report is awesome for just like giving us all this information and helping stratas keep record of this information.
I think that's a good way to wrap it up, Denny. Yeah, right. And I will say, just to add to that, there's certain parts of this town, like Kitsilano, where some of the buildings are absolutely falling apart, and gutter systems keeping water off cars and depreciation reports would be terrible. Yeah. But there's still desirable places to live. And so recognize when you are buying in a place, really look at how much is the land worth in this place, because sometimes the land is worth more than the structure, or at least at par with it. Yeah. Anyway, no, this was good.
We've got one of those right now. We got to burn. This is the last little.
We'll close out the depreciation report podcast. Thanks for listening, everyone.